to get the energy of the channeler. And I think it's really linked with the same type of entity, or entities that are linked to the entities you're describing.
Yeah, I think you're right. And you brought up another good point too. Is other causes that I've seen were people who were playing with Ouija boards, or there's a whole group that were infested with voices by using these spirit boxes, where they would talk to spirits through these spirit boxes, and then that voice started talking to them in their heads, and they were then considered psychotic because that voice wouldn't go away. So Ouija boards and tarot cards and channeling, asking these spirits to come and talk to them, they have no idea what they're doing, or what they're attracting. Another thing that I saw early on was that schizophrenics at the state hospital, they didn't want to go to church. They didn't want to go to ice cream socials held by the chaplain. They didn't want to go to Bible study. They wanted nothing to do with religion or the Bible or church or anything. And I would ask them, why are you sitting up on the ward here when the chaplain has cake and ice cream downstairs and there's a social down there? And they go, well, I don't believe in God. I don't believe in the Bible. They were anti-religious. And the ones who did try to read the Bible or go to church, the voices would get very upset with them. They'd start. There would be three classes of those. There would be, if the voices were weak and the person went to church, the voices would shut up when they got into the church. If the voices were moderately strong, when they got into the church, the voices would start talking and yabbing and trying to block out anything the preacher had to say. They didn't want them to hear it. And if the voices were very strong, it would make it so miserable for them that they would actually jump up and run out of the church. So why would a hallucination be anti-religious?
Yeah, and then again, it's very interesting because I've met people who are mediums, genuine mediums, in the sense that they're in contact with non-human entities, and they're not schizophrenic or anything, but they won't even go near a church. And you can go near a church without being religious. You can visit a church. You can visit a church. See, especially in Europe, there's very beautiful churches, so you can just visit them. But they won't go near a church. It's very strange that I find that very strange. So you can see again that it's the same type of entities that affect some medium in a more discreet way than schizophrenics, but the theme is there.
Yeah, I think I've never had the guts to do this, but I think if a psychiatrist were to pour holy water on a schizophrenic, they would get one hell of a reaction. I bet money on it. So here's all these things where the voices run patterns. Another pattern they run is they get louder after sunset. So when the sun goes down, they get louder, and they are the loudest between 3 and 4 in the morning. Why would that be? They wake the patient up at 3 or 4 in the morning. They get louder when ignored. So I remember back in the state hospital when sitting there watching a psychiatrist work with one patient, he said, just ignore the voices, just ignore them. And I wondered how that worked. So I called that guy back a week later, and I said, how's that working for you? He said, it doesn't work at all. Matter of fact, the voices get louder when you ignore them. They won't be ignored. They demand the patient's attention. So I checked that out with a bunch of others, and they all said the same thing. You can't ignore them. They won't be ignored. They won't go away. They won't get less. They get louder if you try to ignore them. And that's standard. That's a pattern. They foster self-destructive behavior. That was another thing I saw. All the schizophrenics would sabotage themselves. As they got close to succeeding at anything, they would do something to mess it up. They'd cuss out the teacher in class. They wouldn't do their homework. They're about to graduate. They're just about to graduate with a certificate in cosmetology or hair cutting or some trade, and then they do something to mess it up. They go off their medications. And the medications were interesting because I couldn't figure out why. So I started doing some experiments there. I was always experimenting, and they didn't. That's one of the reasons I got into trouble with especially when we found the cure for schizophrenia, and people and the prisoners were starting to fully recover. The authorities did not like that. They went nuts. I ended up in front of the medical board, the medical director, being accused of experimenting with patients, with inmates without departmental permission, which I would have never got. Basically all I was.
Yeah, you was saying that the voices don't want to be ignored, basically.
Yeah, they don't want to be ignored, and they foster isolation, which is the worst thing a schizophrenic can do, is isolate himself, because then the voices have complete access to him and there's no interference. So one thing the mothers can do, mothers of schizophrenics, is to keep their son or daughter occupied in some interesting activity, because the voices are after the attention of the victim. If they can't get the attention of the victim, then they can't order them to do this self-destructive things. And what they end up doing is they're after more and more control. That's what they're after. They want to control the person totally, 100%. And when they do, they just you have a monster on your hands.
Is that what you can deem when a person's controlled 100%? Is that what's deemed in popular language as demonic possession?
Yeah, that would be. Matter of fact, at a future time, I know I've been working with a lady whose son here was a psychotic killer. He killed, I think, 4 or 5 people. And the last one, he cut his girlfriend up into little pieces, and they still haven't found her body. And she's willing to talk about that and what she saw and how the voices played into that. The voices foster isolation. They want the person. They hate husbands. They hate wives. They hate girlfriends. And they're constantly telling people negative stuff about their mothers, their fathers, their girlfriends. Don't trust them. They're trying to screw you. They're talking behind your back. They don't really care about you. All that kind of stuff. One of the things I couldn't figure out was why they would go off their meds. Now it stands to reason that the side effects are awful, but when you look at the psychotic state that they would go into, if they were off their meds, it was much, much worse. So I'm like going, almost all of them would go off their meds. And it was almost like they were voluntarily choosing to go psychotic again. And that was the result. You go off your meds, you go psychotic. And virtually every single one of them would say the psychotic state was much worse than the side effects of these meds. At least they were somewhat calmed down. They could sleep with the meds. The voices were less, they weren't as strong. Okay, so the meds did do that. They cured absolutely nothing, but they weakened the voices where these people, some of them could actually begin to function again. So here they are somewhat functional, and then all of a sudden they decide to go off their meds. And I would ask them, well, what's worse, the meds or being psychotic? And they would all say being psychotic was much worse. That brings up another thought is what the voices would tell these patients was they point to the awful side effects of these antipsychotic meds, and they would tell the patient that you're being poisoned by the psychiatrist. And these are the effects of you being poisoned. And in effect, they were being poisoned by the psychiatrist. These meds are toxic. They do cause permanent damage to the brain if they're used long enough. And that's what would bring about the attacks on the psychiatrist. So when I first went to the state hospital, I would see that the psychiatrists were being beat up by schizophrenics at a rate that was much, much higher than assault on any of the other staff, psych nurses, counselors, psychologists, dentists, all the rest. It was the psychiatrists who were being assaulted by these patients at a much higher rate than anybody else. And I'm wondering, well, why is that happening? Because the psychiatrists in the institutions, in the state institutions, are only spending 15 to 20 minutes a month with these people. And I'm like, what are they doing to piss these guys off so bad that they're getting beat up in 15 or 20 minutes once a month that they spend with these guys, where the assault rate on attendants that are with them 24 hours a day is roughly equivalent to the assault rate on psychiatrists. Why is that? And it turns out that it's because the voices don't want the patient to take those meds, because the meds weaken the voices. Even though they don't get rid of them, they weaken them and they calm the patient down. They're major tranquilizers. And the voices need to keep the patient upset. They need to keep them angry, anxious, fearful, shameful, in some negative state in order to generate that negative emotional energy that they feed off of. And when the patient is worked out and tranquilized, they can't do that. It's harder for them to do that. So they don't want them taking those medications. And they'll tell them they're poisoned, you're being poisoned. And the patient can look for himself and see that they are being poisoned. But at least they can somewhat function. So when I started checking into that and asking patients like, well, why are you going off the meds? They would all say because of the side effects. So what I would do is I drew up two conditions. I would ask them when they went off their meds and they went back on and they recovered and they were sane again. I would give them a blank piece of paper and say, write down all the reasons, all the side effects that you had from your medications, because they don't all experience the same side effects. So they'd write down 5 or 6 side effects, and then I'd give them a checklist of all the psychotic symptoms of paranoid schizophrenia taken out of the DSM, and say, well, put a check mark next to each one of these awful experiences you've had when you weren't on the meds. And bam, the bam, 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 all these horrible experiences, monsters coming out of the wall, blood coming out of the wall, voices telling them to kill themselves, people talking behind their backs, voices appearing out of nowhere, all these horrible things. And I said, put a check mark next to each one of these you've experienced. And then when they were done, I'd hand them both back to them. I said, which one is worst? And every single one of them would say the symptoms of psychosis were much worse. And then I'd ask them, well, then why do you go off your meds? And every single one of them would say, I don't know. And I'm like, if they don't know, who does? And that went on for like 3 years. I felt like a crazy guy myself, asking the same question over and over and over again and getting the same response to this situation that didn't make any sense. Why are they choosing the worst of those two choices, the much worst, consistently choosing it? And virtually all of them at some point go off their meds, and they'll go off their meds over and over and over and over again.
Yeah, it's the voices are really trying to destroy them in every aspect. And they, like with the medicines, the small positive side of them is that they tranquilize the patient. But what the entities do is they exacerbate the negative side of the medicines. They exacerbate everything that's negative. They blow the negative up and destroy the positive. Yeah, you're right on with that. I mean, that's right on the head. That's right. That's exactly what they do. If a bad situation comes up for a schizophrenic, they'll take that and they'll magnify it. They'll pour gasoline on the fire and make it as bad as they possibly can. And one of the opposite things you can do is when something good happens to you is accentuate that. They don't like that. They want your mind to be totally in the negative. They don't care about you. They want that negative emotional energy to be generated. That's what they feed off of. So they foster isolation. They hate parents. They hate marriages. They hate babies. They hate girlfriends. They hate families. They want the person totally isolated, apart from everybody who could possibly help them. That they'll exacerbate a fear that's not grounded in reality and just take away all everything that's good. You'll just think about a fear that's not grounded in reality. And I've noticed that it happens to a lot of people. It's very subtle how they work, and at different degrees. The extreme degrees are schizophrenic, and you've got a slight fear about planes. That's just an example. You'll be thinking all the time about the plane journey going there, the plane journey back, and you won't even think about the holidays. And I've noticed that with a lot of people, and that's everyday examples.
To them, it doesn't matter how they generate that negative emotional energy. And one of the most prevalent ways they do that is by telling lies to their victims and trying to get their victims to believe their lies. So I noticed that when I was working with them at the state hospital, that the voices would tell them constant stream of lies that would upset them. And one of the things I'd point up is, do you trust these things? And they go, no, I don't trust them. But yet they would listen to them. It's almost like they couldn't blot them out of their minds. The voices could go in there and they could pull up every negative memory that they've ever had and bring it to their attention and say, look at this, look what a rotten person you are. You did this, you did that, you said this, you said that. They're constant liars. And it doesn't matter to them what they tell you as long as they can generate that negative emotional energy. So when I met Sherry, she came up with something called the That's a Lie program, which again says every negative thought about yourself or anybody else is a lie. So it's the same thing with what the voices tell these patients, that virtually everything they tell these patients, schizophrenics, is a lie. If they can't convince you that they're telling the truth, then they can't grab onto that. I think we talk about that in our book also. So what psychiatry and psychology should be looking at is how to get rid of these entities instead of how to drug the brain. So what psychiatry and psychology should be looking at is how to get rid of these entities instead of how to drug the brain.
When you fight with the demon, that creates negative energy and it feeds the demon back. And Paul and Benny know that in most of the cases, the exorcism succeeded to start with, and then the entities come back with a vengeance. And that's because there's a lot of violence in the exorcism. And what I like with your methods is that they're very simple.
Well, the other thing is you're not teaching the patient how to get rid of the voices themselves. You're depending on the preacher to do that. Now, they can do that. I've seen it done. I've done it. But the thing is, if you don't teach the patient how to get rid of the voices themselves, it's a temporary thing. It's like, they have to change the channel. They have to change their frequency, and they have to do that by moving in a positive spiritual direction. Now, that's something that psychiatry and psychology aren't going to touch. They have no concept that the human being is a spiritual entity, in a human body. Especially psychiatry, their whole identity depends on them being able to drug the brain and to get people to believe that they have broken brains and there's something wrong with them. But if you look at it, all these mental illnesses have to do with thought, your thought processes. If you're obsessive compulsive, those are obsessive compulsive thoughts. They're not your thoughts. They don't belong to you. You're the one who's watching them. You're the one who's listening to them. You are not the thoughts. So that's the first thing people need to wake up to, is that they are not their thoughts, and their thoughts may or may not belong to who they are. Swedenborg says none of your thoughts are your own. They come from another dimension, and they are energetic entities. Nobody's ever seen a thought. Nobody's ever poked a thought. They belong to another universe, and they're very difficult to study because there is no physical form to them. They're energetic entities, and I've seen the same thing with exorcisms. They drive away these things for a while, and then they come back with a vengeance, just like you said. It doesn't solve the problem. It doesn't solve the problem because the person isn't changing their frequency. They need to get on a positive spiritual path and stay there. They're already at the end of the road in the negative side, and it's a dualistic universe. There's good, there's bad, there's black, there's white, there's hot, there's cold. So they're at the negative end of things. And they must realize that there's a positive entities also. But those positive entities, they don't step in unless the person's right on the verge of death most of the time. And they don't talk in words, they talk in feelings and intuition. And they can't help the patient unless he asks for that help. They're not allowed to interfere with the person's life against the person's will. That's not so with the negative entities. They can barge in there and do whatever they want whenever they want. Nothing to stop them. So the exorcism doesn't work. They have to realize that they are not their thoughts, and that there's a difference between their thoughts and who they are. What they're after is your attention. They're like fishermen grasping, they bait the hook. They can go in your mind and they can pull up every negative thing you ever did, and they cast the hook and they go, well, let me see if you bite on that one. And they throw this thought in your face and see if you react. If you react to it, they got you. Now they're generating negative emotional energy and they're feeding off it. So it's like what Carlos Castaneda says is they give you their mind. So what you have is two minds in there, the patient's mind and the mind of this entity that has invaded your thought processes. And they hit us all. It's not just, it's schizophrenics where it's most predominant, but they hit us all. Murder mysteries, all that kind of stuff. That just feeds these negative entities. So what happens with a lot of songs is you have, oh, my boyfriend left me and I'm going to die and I just can't stand in life anymore and I can't live without him. And, or that rap music is like, yeah, kill the police, and they'll take that and they'll use it to generate negative emotional energy. They can't take music that doesn't have any words. They're not going to like it. They don't like the 369 frequency either. So, if you go to YouTube and you get that frequency and play it, they hate that. They hate the 23rd Psalm. A number of patients have told me that repeating the 23rd Psalm is like throwing worms on a hot frying pan. They can't stand it. It's like punching them in the face. So why would a hallucination react to the 23rd Psalm? So he said all this bullcrap that psychiatry is putting over on the population. If they would study these voices, they would see that there's a number of patterns that they run over and over again. Gaslighting is another one. I remember one patient where they convinced him that he had murdered somebody, and he didn't know whether he had or not. He wasn't sure.